We're reporting on what you can see is clearly a breaking point in the use of federal force over the weekend. And I'm going to just show you some key moments here, and you can see with your own eyes what it looks like to be patrolled in America under the Trump administration right now. President Trump is radically expanding the use of military-style, militarized, and sometimes actual military patrols. These are new images. You can see federal agents in tactical gear in Portland, Oregon, brandishing their crowd control rifles and their gas masks. There was a smoke grenade deployed. You can see that there. It's outside an ICE detention facility in Chicago. We saw federal agents using tear gas. And that wasn't being used for, say, an immigration raid alone or for, say, public safety. There are times where lawful use of those methods can be for the public safety. But much of this on screen with these images was to counter the public reaction from protesters, including American citizens, exercising their rights against this. What you see. This is America over the weekend. And there's a lot going on, and we'll get into it. And if you watch this program, you know we cover a lot of different things. But if you lived on that block or in that community, you can imagine what a big deal it is. If you're in some other part of the country or a red state that's not getting this kind of treatment, maybe you're less aware of it. But this is the news. We saw one agent seen with a tear gas launcher. These federal forces under Trump are also clearly girded and ready for escalation. You got to pack those type of weapons to then be ready to use them. The AP, nonpartisan outlet, reporting just the facts that the Trump administration has helicopters and chemical agents ready to go as immigration agents are increasingly, quote, aggressive in Chicago. They also ran a, quote, military-style raid, which landed a helicopter. There were windows cracked, doors broken down. I'm showing you this because this is what's happening. It's an escalation of, quote, aggressive, as the AP put it, military tactics ordered by President Trump in our American cities. And much of it is blatantly partisan targeting. So you can have one debate about the use of force and how far to go. Then you have another debate about whether this is the use of force for all places in the country. That wouldn't make it okay, but would make it uniform. Or whether things are so politicized and that's getting so normalized that the president has these kind of aggressive tactics with the launchers I showed you here in places that he perceives as his opposition, and something else there in places he perceives as his support, which is, according to the Constitution, an un-American view when we are all equal before the law. The president using the feds in the places that voted against him, and thus trying to override what has been largely Democratic governors pushing back against this. And he's tried to pull in guard troops from other states in a highly unusual bid to do an end run around some of the restrictions that protect your rights. Judges have rejected or narrowed some of these efforts when tested in the courts, rulings admonishing the president for treating America like a war zone and for treating you, American citizens, like some sort of foreign threat. Now, that is becoming quite literal because I can tell you they're not stopping at the images I just showed you. There is now discussion in the military among Pentagon brass and the generals about using the Army's 82nd Airborne, deploying that here at home. It's an infantry division that is typically, as one report put it, for combat zones. Indeed, that is where it was used in both world wars, Vietnam and Afghanistan. You see what's happening? It's not about whether you agreed with Trump or voted for Trump. This is not normal. And the public knows it. We're talking about footage of war zones, because if I go to find, and our producers and journalists find, well, where do we get a picture, an image, or a video of the 82nd Infantry? You're going to get video from past wars, because that's when any other president in either party ever used it. The public is not okay with this. One example, I showed you the photos of the force. We also saw protesters out, many of them peaceful. One holding this sign, pleading with us to see it, and I will say this protester is seen. I showed you the ICE agents. I showed you federal forces. I'm also going to show you people standing up. The protester telling the nation this message: your humanity is more important than your orders are. That might apply to people directly inside the government who, of course, have orders from the president. But lately, with this kind of president, that could apply to people on college campuses or in media organizations where the president is trying to issue orders and see who will fall in line. Remember, some of the largest Trump protests are about this exact abuse of power. No kings, no military rule. There are other things that has made Trump unpopular. We can get into those. But the big No Kings protests were about this type of abuse of power and how this can correlate with attacks on democracy and elections themselves. The nonpartisan outlet Politico reports, as a matter of fact, not criticism, that it's become clear the president hopes to normalize the use of the military on American streets to quell protests and enforce his policy agenda. That's not what the military is for. The pushback continues. The Democratic governor of Illinois speaking out.
U.S. citizens, including children, have been traumatized and detained. This escalation of violence is targeted and intentional and premeditated. The Trump administration is following a playbook: cause chaos, create fear and confusion, make it seem like peaceful protesters are a mob. He wants to justify and normalize the presence of armed soldiers under his direct command.
This is happening here. Now, I mentioned the laws against this. The military is legally restricted from patrolling American citizens. And the president at times has seemed to flout that, other times has rooted this in what are potentially lawful goals. ICE enforcement, immigration enforcement, those are valid federal powers, but not when used as a pretext only in parts of the country. We have immigration issues, for example, across many border states, Texas among them. Chicago is not the only place. And so there is going to be potentially a larger reckoning over whether this is a real thing or normalizing the abuse of power thing. The rulings against this are important because they're testing what they can get away with. In the new clashes, we can report that tonight, Illinois, Oregon, and California are taking Trump to court, trying to stop them from sending these guard troops across different state lines as the end run. A federal judge ruled this week that we still are a nation of constitutional law, not martial law, and warning against blurring the line between the civil and military federal power to the detriment of this nation. That judge blocked Trump a second time. Politico's headline: Judge blocks Trump's National Guard deployment in Portland for a second time because of the loophole effort to get around the first blockage by moving these troops from one state to another. People often ask, when will we have a constitutional crisis? Will it be clear? Will it be like the Saturday Night Massacre under Nixon or some earlier periods of history, whatever you want to pull from? But you have to remember, some crises don't happen in a dramatic single moment. Sometimes they happen slowly over time until you look up and you say, why are there so many militarized people or actual soldiers or the 82nd Infantry patrolling my line to the polls in the midterms? And by then, if you want to go to court and stop it, it may be too late. I want to bring in Reverend Al Sharpton, the host of Politics Nation here on MSNBC, founder of the National Action Network, and among other things, an expert on the long struggle for voting rights in this country, which is relevant to these federal powers, and Molly Jong-Fast, an MSNBC analyst, and we can note tonight now a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. Congrats to you on that media news.
Thank you.
Great to have you both here. Rev, I'll start with you. This type of federal power being used in these certain places tells you what about where we are in watching the autocratic risk tonight?
Well, we are very close to an autocracy if we're not there. When you see this kind of force being used, military style, on U.S. citizens, under the guise of we're going after illegal immigrants. And when you see the policies that are side by side with it, it is a cause for us to hit the alarm button in this country for democracy. When we see this president put tariffs on China at 145 and then bails out Argentina, and then what he did was break are some of the farmers that voted for him that were depending on selling soybeans to China. And then Argentina took the bailout money and started selling soybeans to China. So there's not even a rhyme or reason to what he's doing. It's brute force, and it's on American citizens. Kids dragged out in Chicago putting zip bags. This is unbelievable, and it's un-American.
And Molly, you get the feeling that he's not doing it everywhere because there's a heck of a lot of places that wouldn't like it.
And if you listen to that Pritzker press conference today, he talks about why is Donald Trump targeting Illinois? And he also talked about, I mean, the thing that was so striking about that press conference is somebody was killed. You know, Pritzker was talking about this. They have not gotten good answers from ICE. And I think it is really scary. The one thing that gives me a little bit of, I don't want to say hope, but a little bit of hope is that you see these Democratic AGs and Democratic governors pushing back, documenting everything. And what Pritzker said yesterday, or a couple days ago, which I think was so important, was he said, stay peaceful and document everything. You have a cell phone, you have a video, you have a lot of power in that cell phone.
Besides former FBI Director Jim Comey, there is pretty much no one more frequently attacked and maligned and feared, disliked by Donald Trump than New York Attorney General Letitia James. The New York AG brought a successful civil suit against Trump and his businesses, with the judge last year finding that Trump and his company knowingly committed fraud for years. Trump has maintained her case was a politically motivated attack against him. This May, an ally of Donald Trump's accused James of mortgage fraud, the same claim that has been made against other perceived enemies of Donald Trump. But now, according to new reporting by MSNBC, we're learning this, quote, a top prosecutor in Virginia has informed colleagues that she plans to decline to seek charges against New York Attorney General Tish James, resisting intense pressure from President Donald Trump. That's according to two people familiar with her discussions. Elizabeth Yusi, who oversees major criminal prosecutions in the Norfolk office of the Eastern District of Virginia, has confided to coworkers that she sees no probable cause to believe that James engaged in mortgage fraud, the two sources told MSNBC. UC plans to present her conclusions to the president's new acting U.S. attorney, Lindsay Halligan, in the coming weeks, they said. Halligan, keep in mind, is new to her position because her predecessor, Eric Siebert, followed a similar path. He resigned after he refused to bow to Trump's pressure campaign to criminally indict Jim Comey and James, despite knowing that there wasn't enough evidence to bring successful cases against either of them. So Halligan, the insurance lawyer, goes in there to do what Eric Siebert would not do. She did go on to get a grand jury to indict Jim Comey on 2 charges. And according to new reporting in Reuters, there was another individual who lost their job due to standing up to Trump's wishes, defying Trump's wishes, to perp walk Jim Comey. Quote, an FBI agent was relieved of duty for declining to arrange a perp walk of the Bureau's former director, Jim Comey, in front of news media cameras after Comey was federally charged last month. That's according to 4 people briefed on the matter. That is where we begin the hour. Some of our favorite reporters and friends. MSNBC senior investigative correspondent Carol Leonnig is here. She and our colleague Ken Delaney were first to report on this new prosecutor resisting bringing charges against Letitia James. Also joining us, former acting assistant attorney general for national security at the Department of Justice, Mary McCord. And with me at the table, retired FBI agent, MSNBC national security and intelligence analyst Chris O'Leary is back. Carol Leonnig, take me through what you're reporting.
Well, what we heard, Nicole, over the last couple of, I guess, days and hours is that a prosecutor who's a supervisor had a job like Mary McCord's was many years ago, overseeing criminal prosecutions for her U.S. Attorney's Office. She concluded that there's just not probable cause to bring the case of mortgage fraud or bank fraud or any kind of fraud against Letitia James based on the documentation and the evidence before her. We're also hearing that in the grand jury, material has been brought forward, witnesses have been asked questions, and her conclusion is the same as Eric Seibert, her former boss, the U.S. Attorney of the Eastern District, who said, there's just not a sufficient basis to bring this case. And, you know, Nicole, I want to emphasize something for people at home who aren't lawyers or don't follow this the way you and I do. It is a prosecutor's job and almost their solemn vow to bring cases where they believe they have a very high likelihood of sustaining and convicting on the charges they bring. And in this instance now, multiple people have concluded. Career prosecutors, supervisors, Trump appointees have said, we don't have a basis to do this. So that is why it's so stunning that yet another person is still pushing for this, Donald Trump. And it's also stunning that another person way down in a small, tiny office of the Eastern District of Virginia is willing to put her neck out there and say, this case still doesn't fly.
Carol, let me read a little bit more of your reporting and then ask you what the response has been to your reporting. You write this, quote, on Friday, the top national security prosecutor in Virginia's Eastern District railed against Justice Department political appointees for carrying out Trump's directives rather than fulfilling their oaths to, quote, follow the facts and the law wherever they lead, free from fear or favor, and unhindered by political interference. The prosecutor, Michael Ben-Ari, had been fired after a Trump ally questioned his loyalty to Trump in a social media post. Ben-Ari wrote in a letter, quote, in recent months, the political leadership of the department have violated these principles, jeopardizing our national security and making American citizens less safe. I wonder, Carol, if you can just speak to how extraordinary all the calls from inside the House are. These are all people that did not leave after last November when Trump won. They're not people who left after January 20th when he was inaugurated and went to the Department of Justice and gave a speech, which is extraordinarily rare, exceedingly rare, I believe unprecedented, where he called out people like Mark Elias for prosecution. They didn't leave when he started tweeting at Pam. I mean, they have stayed there to do whatever they could do to protect the institution they love. Most people have these jobs for a very, very long time. A lot of career people don't go there to jump to a law firm to make more money. They are true public servants, especially on the national security side. What do all of these calls, and I just want to put up a list, Danielle Sassoon, former acting U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, resigned. Hagen Scotton, Sassoon's deputy, resigned. Eric Seibert, the former attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia who refused to charge Jim Comey and Tish James, resigned. Elizabeth Oyer, former pardon lawyer who refused to reinstate Mel Gibson's gun rights, fired. Michael Feinberg, now a contributor here, former FBI assistant special agent who was targeted for being friends with Pete Strzok, resigned. Brian Driscoll, Steve Jensen, Spencer Evans, former senior FBI leadership who filed a lawsuit saying they were dismissed in a campaign of retribution, fired. And the stories we're talking about today, FBI agent who refused to arrange the perp walk for Comey, fired. What does it say that all these calls are from inside?
And by the way, Nicole, when you list all those names, it's kind of devastating, right? But I could add about 25 more that are critical to the, metaphorical security blanket that is wrapped around America, and now those people are no longer inside. You know, you said something so important, and it's about the mission that people have sworn themselves and their lives and their free time to. The mission is so important and motivating for so many of the individuals that you've described, but also thousands more who stay in the Department of Justice despite this amazing, it's not even a tilt, despite this amazing effort to use the power of this institution to basically avenge Donald Trump's anger and his desire for retribution, and to meet his specific whims at that time, his political gain, his personal gain. So many of these people remain there hoping, and I've talked to many of them, hoping that they will be a bulwark against exactly that they will put their bodies essentially in front of the bulldozer as it's coming their way. And as you have reported, as we have reported, as my colleague Ken and I have tried to document, the bulldozer is coming for more and more of them every day.
Well, let's keep the bulldozer going. I mean, is this prosecutor who says there's no case against Letitia James, is her job safe? Is she still working there today?
She is. There are people bracing for her presentation to the acting U.S. attorney, Lindsay Halligan, to have consequences. We don't speculate about what's going to happen. We know what's happened in the rear view to the former U.S. attorney who said there was insufficient evidence to bring this case. And there's a perfectly good reason for her peers and colleagues to be worried about her future. I will remind you that in the Southern District, you mentioned Danielle Sassoon, the former U.S. attorney, a Republican, a Federalist Society member, chosen specifically for that acting position when Trump first got into office because she was believed to be somebody so-called on the team. And, there are a lot of people who are in the Justice Department leadership right now, political appointees, who are trying to avoid the bloodbath that followed Danielle Sassoon resigning rather than dismiss the charges, the corruption charges against Mayor Eric Adams in New York. And one after another, a bulldozer came for those individuals, and they resigned rather than give Trump what he wanted.
Joining us now, MSNBC senior White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, Eugene Robinson, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and MSNBC political analyst, and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. So, Vaughn, is the Trump administration's deployment of the National Guard a response to a problem, or is it creating one? I guess that's really what's at the heart of this, isn't it?
Right, and it's exactly what is at the heart of these legal proceedings in the Trump-appointed judges' rulings over the weekend, pushing back against the National Guard being able to be deployed to Oregon, stating effectively that the characterization that the president has portrayed of Portland burning is not an accurate one. And if you look at what the Portland police chief in an op-ed posted just in the last 24 hours said very explicitly, unfortunately, national portrayals often distort reality. Portland is 145 square miles, yet one city block has drawn outsized attention in news cycles. Viral clips, sometimes months or years old, paint a picture that is not consistent with the Portland we see every day. Just because officers are not seen wearing tactical gear, lining up before crowds, does not mean we are not responding, referring to the Portland Police Department. Again, this is part of the standoff as local and state officials in Oregon and in Chicago and Illinois argue that local law enforcement can effectively handle what is being alleged by the Trump administration to be acts intending to stop the federal law enforcement efforts of ICE officials. And so this really gets at the heart of what is a juxtaposition here, in which we saw in just the last hour, a group of journalists in Chicago file a lawsuit making the case that the Department of Homeland Security is also interfering in their First Amendment abilities to effectively cover what is taking place here in Chicago. And so to the heart of your question here is what we are seeing being heavily pushed back and scrutinized is what is the long-term plan of this White House and of this Pentagon, as J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, has suggested that they are using the idea that there are riots and buildings burning to justify long-term military status inside of these cities. We should note here in Washington, D.C., the National Guard members, they remain in the streets of Washington. This is a question of just how long they will exist here, and that is where you see in other cities that question being posed here as litigation is filed, and these lawsuits are filed to stop National Guard from making their way into their cities.
Well, one thing we can say for sure, Lisa, that judge did not mince words. She was grilling the attorney for the federal government, saying things like, aren't defendants simply circumventing my order? Why is this appropriate? So talk about where this goes next, and then you have another court challenge here from journalists.
Well, in terms of the Portland challenges, at this point, Judge Karen Immergut has entered 2 consecutive temporary restraining orders. The first about the use of the Oregon National Guard in Oregon, the second about any National Guard in Oregon. And I expect that the Trump administration will appeal that second ruling as well. They already have a pending motion to stay her first order at the Ninth Circuit. That's the U.S. Court of Appeals, that intermediate level of the court. That court has done nothing yet. It has not scheduled a hearing. And so we are furiously, if you see me looking down on my phone, furiously updating to see if the Trump administration is going to get relief. In the meantime, in Chicago, Vaughn was alluding to a class action that was filed earlier today by protesters who have said that what is really aggravating the situation on the ground is the way that ICE and the CBP officers are acting. A judge who has been assigned that case, Sarah Ellis, has scheduled a TRO hearing of her own. That's for a temporary restraining order at 2:30 p.m. Central Time today. So we may know more about how ICE and Customs and Border Patrol is allowed to operate on the ground with respect to protests by sometime this afternoon or evening.
All right. So, Eugene, when you look at the pictures, the president says it's a war zone. And when you see the deployment of troops, it can look like that, right? He says Portland is burning to the ground. The AP points out local officials have pointed out that the protest occupies one city block far from downtown in a city that covers 145 square miles. Portland's police chief, in an op-ed, wrote, "National portrayals of Portland distort from reality." And here's what residents say.
This is not war-torn. This is Portland.
We don't need help. We got it under control. Take a look.
The thing that's harming us is the escalation tactics that Trump's trying to use to create a narrative that, you know, Portland is this boogeyman that requires further militarization, and we just don't.
I'm hopeful that the courts, and I'm hopeful that ultimately common sense prevails and, you know, we continue to be peaceful and not allow these things to happen in our cities and states.
And Eugene, look, officials are arguing the only time it looks like a war zone is when tear gas and smoke bombs are used against peaceful protests. So what does the administration get out of this?
Well, you know, they think they get, I guess, riling up the MAGA base. Look, Gavin Newsom said today that we're on the brink of martial law. I hope he's exaggerating there, but I do think it's an important moment. Portland obviously is not burning to the ground. It's not burning at all. It's just not happening. The president is lying when he says that is happening and uses it as justification for trying to mobilize the National Guard. And what he seems to be trying to do is suppress protest, which you can't do in this country. Every one of us has the right to protest. That's free speech. That is fundamental to the most basic idea of this country. And yet he is waging a war against that. Yeah, people in Portland, it's not a city that voted for him, and people come out and protest actions that he's taking, including the ICE raids. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's the way this country works.
So, you know, there are a lot of important legal questions, to your point, Eugene, constitutional questions. But there's also a political one, given that the two governors that we're talking about both have been talked about as possible presidential candidates, right, in 2028. Oh, yeah. Look, in looking tough or making it seem like they're tough, Trump has made it clear he wants a tough response to cities that he believes are crime-ridden, in spite of what the statistics may show. Is it possible, though, that what he's actually doing is setting up some potential challengers that he won't have to run against for president because he can't?
Yeah, I guess he is. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that he has gone after the states that are led by Gavin Newsom and J.B. Pritzker, who are seen as two possible Democratic presidential candidates in 2028. No, he won't have to run against them. You know, he is so usually so self-interested in terms of politics. Maybe this is a case of him trying to ensure the future of MAGA after him, and to sort of insulate it against the likes of Newsom or Pritzker. But no, I don't think that's an accident. There's always a political element to the motive, and look, from the other side, Pritzker and Newsom both get to sort of raise their profiles by
and look tough themselves, right?
Yeah, exactly, with their tough responses. And that's what a lot of Democrats have wanted. The Democratic base has been clamoring for a tougher response to what President Trump has done over these months. And Newsom and Pritzker are giving it to them.
Real quickly, so I out of the corner of my eye, I can see you continuing to refresh. Anything yet? When might we hear whether or not it's the appellate court, right, that will make a decision here?
Any day, any time now, they could tell us whether they're going to grant a stay of that lower court's order, which would effectively allow President Trump to send in National Guard troops to Portland. We haven't heard yet, and I'll continue to monitor it today, Chris.
Vaughn Hilliard, Eugene Robinson, Lisa Rubin, thank you all.
Joining us now, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, MSNBC senior political and national correspondent Jacob Soboroff, who was at the governor's office in downtown Chicago, where Governor Pritzker is about to speak at a news conference, retired four-star general and MSNBC military analyst Barry McCaffrey, and presidential historian and professor of history at Rice University, Douglas Brinkley. Doug, because we started with history, I'm going to begin with you. Talk to me about what the nation was like back in the early 1960s. Why the deployment of the National Guard, the federalizing of the National Guard in Mississippi was necessary in that moment, according to JFK.
Well, it all really began in 1954 with Brown versus Topeka, the Supreme Court decision, which integrated and called for the integration of schools. You see flashpoints in 1957 at Central High School with President Eisenhower having to do the same, of sending in National Guards because then Governor Orville Faubus was a segregationist and was refusing to adhere to the Brown decision. And the great clip you just played of President Kennedy, who every time you watch him grows in stature, JFK. But James Meredith was a son of Mississippi. He joined the Air Force after World War II. He was a vet. He quit and he simply wanted to go to school. He thought about going to Jackson State, all-black school, but he decided to go to University of Mississippi, and determined he was. He became an icon and a hero for his persistence. But at Oxford became a war zone, not just having to escort Meredith to class, but Molotov cocktails, as you mentioned, people being killed. And in the end, day after day after day, eventually there was calm in Oxford, but the federal troops stayed there for 10 more months because it was like a war zone in Oxford. Eventually, Meredith got his degree at Ole Miss. There's a statue of him at the stadium at University of Mississippi. And last thing, Meredith went on to get a law degree at Columbia, came back to march for freedom, and was shot numerous times with bird pellet guns, body just riddled with holes some years later. So the racism in that period in the South was deeply intense.
So I wonder, Jacob, have you seen anything commiserate to that in your reporting? Is it that hot out there right now, so hot because of the tension between maybe ICE enforcement and the protesters, that the only way to cool it off would be to send in the National Guard?
That's not what local elected officials say in any of the places that we have seen, and certainly that I have been reporting on the ground, particularly in Los Angeles. In the early nights in Los Angeles, the use of force by the Los Angeles Police Department and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department that preceded the deployment of the National Guard under Title X of U.S. Code by Donald Trump was about a small gathering because of the deployment of the federal immigration enforcement agents to carry out the stated goal of the largest mass deportation campaign in the history of the United States of America. And we are seeing echoes of those types of protests but not some kind of wide-scale citywide violence like you would believe to be happening if you listen to what was happening and being said from the White House and certainly by the president himself, the likes of Stephen Miller, border czar Tom Homan, who was on the ground in Los Angeles, but we haven't seen here. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem was here last week, and there have been flashpoints where I was talking to you from earlier today as we await Governor Pritzker's news conference here on the day that he has sued the federal government over the potential deployment of the National Guard here to Chicago. That facility, the Broadview facility, the neighborhood where the apartment building was raided, there was certainly a clash between law enforcement and the local citizens here. But that was something that the law enforcement themselves initiated by raiding that building in the overnight hours. Same can be said about the enforcement operation that led to the clash, that led to the shooting of the woman who we've been reporting on here today in Chicago. But again, nothing as you drive around Chicago. I'm in the middle of downtown Chicago in the governor's office right now as we wait to hear beyond this lawsuit what he has to say, both to President Trump and about whether or not the state and the city will do any kind of cooperation whatsoever. The mayor, I should note, signed an executive order today saying that they're basically ice-free zones in Chicago at all city property, not to be used for these immigration enforcement activities. The bottom line is local officials do not want this federal presence here. They certainly don't want a military presence on the ground, and they continue to say that over and over. That's, I think, what we're going to hear from Governor Pritzker here in just a couple of minutes as we await him here in downtown Chicago, Katie.
So, General McCaffrey, I'm hoping you can help me just try to poke into this a little bit further. You know, I wasn't alive in 1962, so I can't speak to how it felt down there in Mississippi or how the country felt. But I was alive in the 90s, and I can tell you how it felt in Los Angeles during the LA riots. And it was scary in Los Angeles. I mean, it was not the entire city. It's a giant city. But there were broad swaths of the city that were lawless and scary. I mean, my dad famously said on camera, it's like the LAPD had abandoned the city of Los Angeles during the riots. He and my mother were over above it, covering the riots as it was happening. Are you seeing anything? Do you have any sympathy for the deployment of the National Guard? Anything that would require the National Guard to come in and assist law enforcement? I mean, we saw a video a few minutes ago of somebody ramming their car into an ICE vehicle. Is that an example of something being a little bit too hot to need the National Guard?
Well, look, there is no insurrection. The cities aren't burning. This is all nonsense. This is a political drama being played out by President Trump. The National Guard is a treasured institution of the country, 430,000 strong. They're our friends and neighbors. They're present at every humanitarian disaster. They are incapable of effectively serving as community law enforcement. So a lot of this is nonsense. We're also missing the point when you look at TV and you're looking at camouflage fatigue wearing law enforcement, body armor, helmets, armored vehicles, M4 carbines, rappelling onto roofs. You're seeing a federal police force taking over what should be state and local law enforcement. We're in a very dangerous period for our time. We do not want the U.S. Armed Forces, National Guard, or federal troops on American city streets trying to enforce the law. They're not very good at it. The bigger question, by the way, has to be asked, who said in the Congress or the voters that we wanted to take 12 million people, deport them from the country, crash the agricultural system, construction, services? Who gave federal law enforcement that authority? Has that been funded by Congress? That's the major question that needs to be addressed by the court system and by Congress.
Lisa, the court system has so far pushed back on Donald Trump's effort to send in the National Guard in many places, including in Oregon. Can't send in the National Guard from Oregon, can't send in the California National Guard, not the Texas National Guard, can't do it. The facts on the ground don't justify it, according to the federal judge out there. When asked about this, Stephen Miller said that there were alternate plans. There were alternate authorities the president have. What do you take that to mean?
I mean, I think the first place that my mind goes is to the Insurrection Act. You were showing that historical footage of President Kennedy when he sent the National Guard to Mississippi and then to Alabama in the 1960s, he did so under the authority of the Insurrection Act, not using Title X, which is the authority that President Trump has relied on now. So far, President Trump has not invoked the Insurrection Act, which is the exception to the Posse Comitatus Act.